everybody, and welcome to Week 14, Part 2 on Early Medieval Art in Europe, where we discuss the art of Carolingian and Ettonian empires. While the Scandinavian and Hiberno-Saxon styles of the last section flourished outside of the original scope of the Roman Empire, that is up here and way up here above the map, there was a whole lot of unrest within and throughout the former Roman Empire on the mainland. During the migration period, the peace and security that the Roman Empire had brought to the mainland of Europe was gone. And so many trade routes and other activities that required travel were soon slowed or even abandoned altogether. The early centuries of the medieval period found that people and institutions focused on the local and distrusting of others, and a loss of the infrastructure of Roman institutions like education, currency, and the military made life really difficult for a lot of people. Smallpox was also a problem from the 6th century onward, leading to an even greater loss of populations in the cities and country. Many barbarian groups ruled quite differently than the Romans did, and the placement of power among dukes and lords rather than centralizing power with a king or queen contributed to the reciprocal system of feudalism that grew so successfully during the Middle Ages. Looking at the situation from a cynical point of view, it's very easy to see how lower-level individual lords could become very wealthy off the backs of their serfs. And it's also easy to see how appealing that wealth and power would be, providing an impetus among those benefiting from it to perpetuate the system. But we cannot forget that the Romans themselves provided an apt model for feudalism with their own form of agricultural slavery. Despite the disparate state of mainland Europe, much of the former Roman Empire was reunited in 768 with the Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great, for whom the Carolingians are named, was the successor of Frankish kings. The Franks were already growing an empire from the lands they had taken over from the Romans. Charlemagne had the backing of the papacy and consolidated his empire under Christianity, equating himself with Constantine. He was named Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. Pope Leo III had an interest in gaining protection from Charlemagne, as he was considered to be a commoner, while popes were normally chosen from the elite classes of society. He was hated and even attacked in Rome by his enemies, and Leo was finally sent into exile. Charlemagne rescued him, re-established Leo III in Rome, and drove out the Pope's enemies. Just 2 days later, Leo III names Charlemagne Emperor of Rome. The relationships between Charlemagne and Leo III is emblematic of both the reciprocal nature of power in Europe at this time and the importance of the Catholic Church in political matters in the Middle Ages and onward. This new empire, the Carolingian Empire, let's find that on the map. You can see it here on this pretty good map. Included a large portion of western mainland Europe, including Germany, France, Lombardy, which is part of Italy, and the Low Countries, Belgium and Holland. The Basques of Spain and the Saxons of Germany were especially resistant to this rule. The Saxons still practiced their pre-Christian religion until they were forcibly taken into the Carolingian Empire. Later, the successors of the Saxon kings would become the emperors of the Ettonian dynasty. Charlemagne attempted to restore the grandeur and power of the Roman Empire, but as a Christian emperor. Coin here depicts Charlemagne, showing him wearing a Roman toga, which you can see knotted on the side, and a laurel wreath about his temples, commonly seen in Roman art. You can compare it to an image of Julius Caesar from a coin, where you can see especially the laurel wreath. An equestrian portrait believed to depict Charlemagne or his grandson Charles the Bald is reminiscent of the equestrian portrait of Marcus Aurelius, which was believed during the Middle Ages actually to depict Constantine. But as your book points out, this Carolingian portrait does not present the mustached emperor as a Roman, but a descendant of barbarian culture, for the mustache and the cloak that he wears. The palace chapel of Charlemagne was part of the emperor's complex in Aachen, Germany. The palace chapel may remind us of Byzantine architecture, such as the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. The beautiful interior, decorated with gorgeous stone panels, is octagonal with 2 levels and a clerestory below a dome. One significant difference between the palace chapel and Byzantine architecture, though, is the inclusion of a westwork. The westwork is a more elaborately appointed western entry. Here is the westwork right here. And it's usually flanked by 2 towers. Here you can see the 2 towers, basically semicircles. They don't have spires on top of them, so they're not as noticeable as some of our later towers will be. Here you can see the interior and how it looks like a central plan Byzantine church. And here on the Church of Corvey, you can see how the westwork is built up: 3-part doorway, tall towers, and in this case, some upper stories that were added a little bit later. One way in which Charlemagne tried to restore the grandeur of Rome was through the revival of the arts. As in Ireland, the arts were preserved through the monasteries and illuminated manuscripts. Scribes and artists were charged with standardizing legible scripts and Christian text, which include the correction of many errors made over the course of centuries by transcription. In the Carolingian period, artists, not surprisingly, adopted the Roman tradition shared by the Hiberno-Saxon artists of depicting the evangelists as Roman scribes. In the manuscript, the Godescalc Evangelistory, as well as the Coronation Gospel of Charlemagne, which you can see a page from here, and actually the Ebbo Gospels as well, they each show their respective evangelists with antique-style robes and a Roman-style writing table. You can see that writing table here. Roman-style robe, Roman writing table, Roman robe, very antique looking, right? Okay. The Godescalc Evangelistory has a Hiberno-Saxon feel. Sorry, it's this one. Here it is. Yet the artist is using a more Roman-style realism in the modeling of the figure and rendering it in space. One other difference is the use of gold, an imperial prerogative. The Coronation Gospel of Charlemagne and the Ebbo Gospels have a painterly and even calligraphic-like quality in their miniatures. Miniatures are the full-size images. And here you can see that sort of painterly quality in the style of decoration. This expressive style is also seen in the Utrecht Psalter. Metalworking continued to be important in small art forms. Carolingian books like the Lindau Gospels had extravagantly decorated gold covers set with stones. Cabochon-style pearls and other stones decorate the cover on the screen. Cabochon stones are stones that are not faceted, but instead are just polished and set with a flat bottom. So these are cabochons, these little pearls, and these other stones that are not faceted. They're not cut so that they have sharp edges. Instead, they're just polished and given a flat bottom so that they can be stuck easily onto the surface. Cabochons sit above the surface of the metal, then, in a piece like this. The Lindau Gospels cover depicts a crucifixion, a common theme for gospel book covers. This one, crafted in gold, was done through the repoussé technique, the hammering relief imagery from the back of a sheet of gold. Your textbook offers a very thoughtful interpretation of the symbolism of this particular crucifixion. The richness and power of the Carolingian Empire was threatened by the Vikings. The Carolingian Empire was so weak under Viking attack that the last sole emperor tried to buy the Vikings off. This ineffectual action caused the empire to be challenged in rebellion, and it was eventually divided into 3. The German or Saxon portion of the Carolingian Empire was ruled by the Etonians. The Saxon dynasty, known as the Etonian Empire, ruled the eastern portion of the former Carolingian Empire, modern Germany and Austria, through most of the 10th century. The peace and prosperity during the age of the Etonian dynasty allowed for expansion and growth. Like Charlemagne, Otto I gained the loyalty of the papacy in part by marrying to the Langobard kingdom of Italy. Otto I was crowned Emperor of the Romans just as Charlemagne had been, and he was too equated with Constantine. But Otto I's successful and peaceful union of Germany and Italy and the empire and the church was so powerful and so complete that it had great longevity. Eventually, the empire became known as the Holy Roman Empire. This empire would continue into the 20th century, and it was later known as the Habsburg Empire. Ottonian artists produced gospels, book covers, and other small-scale objects. Crafted in ivory, all with an imperial monumental style reminiscent of Byzantine art. The connection is not only one culture emulating another. Otto II actually married into the Byzantine Empire. The small ivory panel on the right, or on the screen, shows Otto I presenting the Magdeburg Cathedral to Christ. This may remind you of the Byzantine image from the Church of Hagia Sophia of Constantine presenting the church to the Virgin Mary. Otto I presents it with a drape over his hands to distance himself from Christ, and he appears much smaller than the other more sacred figures. The church Otto I holds resembles a Roman or early Christian era basilica plan church, intended to remind the viewer of Otto's connection to Constantine. Not many Ottonian churches remain. However, St. Cyriacus is a great example. St. Cyriacus is a convent church, an abbey church. It has the format of a basilica plan church with a rounded apse at one end, a large open nave, a gallery above the nave, and a clerestory. St. Cyriacus has a westwork with rounded entrance reminiscent of an apse flanked by two towers. The interior is deceptively simple. Much thought went into the effective rhythmic alteration of square and round piers. You can see here round and square piers. And the evenly spaced gallery, nave, and clerestory. Very elegant. The Giro crucifix is of a full-size type of crucifix that would become popular in later churches. Though few examples survive, the Giro crucifix is an excellent example of Ottonian handling of the imagery and subject matter. Christ's body is elongated and thin. His posture and composure indicate that he is dead, rather than triumphant. This reminds us of Byzantine versions of the crucifixion in Mosaic, in which the suffering rather than triumph of Christ was emphasized. These expressive pieces are typical of the era, in that they are made to decorate the interior of the church. Later medieval artists focused on the exterior. The doors of Bishop Bernvard are another example of creative Ottonian style. Bishop Bernvard of Hildesheim oversaw the program and production of the doors. The ambitious undertaking saw the largest work of art cast in lost wax bronze since antiquity. The panels, of which there are 16, are lively, vibrant scenes with few figures that depict narratives from Genesis, which is the first book of the Old Testament, and the Gospels, the New Testament. The layout of the scenes can be observed in the image on the screen or in your book. The doors also established some important traditions in the Middle Ages. Scenes were carefully paired with significant scenes from the Old and New Testaments side by side that would complement one another. For example, the fall of man, the original sin which damned humankind, is paired with the crucifixion on the other side, which is said to have saved humankind from original sin. This is not only narratively interesting and thought-provoking, but it is also an early example of typology, which we'll see more and more of as the Middle Ages roll on. Typology in Christian theology is the idea that figures in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, prefigure or presage events and people in the New Testament. In particular, narratives and imagery of the Old Testament that seem to prefigure the coming of Christ and the Passion are paired with those Christian scenes in order to shore up the claims of the Catholic Church to be the one true church. Aside from typology, the use of a pair of bronze doors as a medium for narrative will also continue through the Middle Ages well into the Renaissance. Ottonian illuminated manuscripts are even more sumptuous and imperial than Carolingian ones. You can see pages from the Aachen Gospels of Otto III, the Lectionary of Henry II, and these all demonstrate great examples of a Etonian imperial style. The St. Luke page from the Aachen Gospel shows that the evangelist is backed in gold. That's the sort of brown color you're seeing here is actually gold leaf. And he's seated inside of a mandorla, which is a full-body halo, which you can see around him, within a beautiful architectural setting reminiscent of the ancient Greco-Roman world. The figures of Christ washing the feet of his disciples are tall and thin, abstracted and stylized, but their robes have a three-dimensional, classical feel. Gold leaf included in this humble scene is not considered strange, as this book was made for the emperor. The attitude of the figures is interesting. Though this scene is often cited for its humble nature, Christ appears tall, hovering over the figures in a rather imperial fashion. So too do we see a similarly forceful attitude in the Annunciation to the shepherds from the lectionary, in which the angel towers over the shepherds, who are at first frightened in accordance with the story. The veneration and coronation of Otto III, of course, is an overt expression of the emperor's power. This double-page image from the Aachen Gospels of Otto III demonstrates the power and holy nature of the emperor's throne. He looks forward, dressed in purple, like a Roman emperor, a better image here, wearing a gold crown and carrying a scepter and an orb with a cross, reminding the viewer that he is a Holy Roman emperor. On the left, representatives from the outposts of the Etonian or Holy Roman Empire bear gifts, or perhaps they represent taxed goods. The four regions of the empire bow to him. Keep in mind that these miniatures are in a gospel book, and that this was not seen as inappropriate. The intricate relationship between church and state in the Middle Ages is well established in this image. The equation of gold and wealth, beauty, art, and power with the holy is one theme of art in the Middle Ages. In the next chapter, we'll see that along with that theme, there's a trend during the Romanesque period towards seeking a more ascetic and simple or pious lifestyle. That lifestyle is hinted at in this pious image of Abbess Hitta from the Hitta Gospels. The abbess, quite a powerful figure in her own right, humbles herself to St. Walpurga, to whom she offers her newly made gospel book. As was customary, Hitta's book was recited to and painted by a scriptorium within her abbey at Meschede near Cologne. The style of the figures and the background may anticipate the Romanesque style of chapter 16 with its more spatial and three-dimensional approach. That wraps up this week on the art of the early Middle Ages, and next week we'll take a look at the next phase of medieval art, the Romanesque period.